It was another ordinary night at the small roadside hotel where Johnny worked as a receptionist on the night shift. The hotel, a modest establishment with only a few rooms, usually didn't receive many guests at that time, especially during the week. The nights were usually quiet, even monotonous, with Johnny spending his time organizing papers, checking reservations and watching television while waiting for dawn. The clock on the wall read 2 a.m. when the phone at reception rang, breaking the usual silence. Johnny, who had almost fallen asleep in his chair, was startled by the shrill sound. He got up slowly and answered it, hoping it was just a lost guest looking for directions, or perhaps someone wanting to know about room availability. "Hotel Bella Vista reception. Good evening," he said, his voice still heavy with sleep. On the other end of the line, a man's voice sounded cold and direct. He wanted to know about the availability of a specific room, number 217. Johnny, consulting the booking system, realized that the hotel was completely full that night. All the rooms, including 217, were occupied. "Sorry, sir," replied Johnny, trying to sound professional despite his tiredness. "We're completely booked tonight. We don't have any rooms available." There was an uncomfortable silence on the line before the man answered. His voice became firmer, almost insistent, asking again for room 217, as if Johnny hadn't understood his initial request. The receptionist repeated that there were no rooms available and asked if the man had a reservation, but the question went unanswered. Instead, the man simply reiterated that he needed the room, as if it were something of the utmost importance. The man's insistence began to make Johnny uncomfortable. There was something about the way he spoke, a cold urgency that didn't match the usual request for a hotel room. But with no other options, Johnny was firm in his response. There were no rooms available. The call ended abruptly, but the discomfort lingered in the air. Johnny looked at the phone for a moment, wondering if he should have answered differently, but dismissed the idea. It was just a strange request on an ordinary night, or at least that's what he expected. Still shaken by the strange call, Johnny tried to return to his usual routine at the hotel reception. However, the feeling of unease persisted, like a shadow hanging over the nocturnal tranquility. He cast furtive glances at his watch, hoping that the time would pass more quickly, but each minute seemed to drag by. About 20 minutes later, the sound of the automatic door at the hotel entrance opening startled Johnny again. He turned around and saw a man walking in. It was hard not to associate him with the voice from the previous call. The man had a disturbing presence, tall, with hard features and an intense gaze that seemed to penetrate directly into Johnny. He was dressed simply, but there was something about his posture that emanated a sense of subtle menace. The man walked slowly to the reception desk, his footsteps echoing in the empty lobby. When he reached the counter, there was no introduction or courtesy. Instead, he pulled a wad of cash from his pocket and placed it on the counter, sliding it towards Johnny. "I need room 217, said the man, his voice now as cold as before, but with a note of authority that made Johnny's stomach turn. Johnny looked at the money for a moment, surprised at the audacity of the offer. It was a lot of money, enough to cover several nights' accommodation, but the thought of accepting it made his discomfort grow. He knew he couldn't and shouldn't accept the bribe. Besides, the room was occupied, and giving in to that request without justification made no sense at all. "I'm sorry, sir," replied Johnny, trying to keep his voice steady despite his growing anxiety. "As I said before, the hotel is full. I can't offer room 217 or any other room." The man remained motionless, his eyes fixed on Johnny. For a moment, the receptionist felt as if time had stopped. The tension in the air was almost palpable. Johnny expected the man to insist again, perhaps even more aggressively. But to his surprise, the stranger simply took the money, put it back in his pocket, and stepped back. "You'll regret this," said the man, with a tone that sent a chill down Johnny's spine. Then, without another word, he turned, and walked out the door, disappearing into the darkness of the parking lot. Johnny stood still for a few seconds, trying to process what had just happened. The hotel fell silent again, but now the silence was oppressive, full of unspoken threats. Even with the man out of sight, Johnny couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was about to happen. He tried to convince himself that the worst was over, but deep down he knew that the night was far from over. Something dark had been awakened, and Johnny could sense that the threat was still there, just waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. After the man left, the hotel seemed to sink into an even deeper, almost suffocating silence. Johnny tried to get back to his routine, but he couldn't concentrate. The stranger's ominous warning echoed in his mind, and the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave him alone. He found himself staring at the front door every few minutes, as if he expected the man to return at any moment. Shortly after 3 a.m., while Johnny was trying to ignore his thoughts and focus on his work, a strange sound broke the silence. It was a muffled noise, almost indistinguishable at first, as if something heavy had fallen to the floor. The sound came from upstairs, from the corridor where room 217 was located. A shiver ran down his spine, and he felt his heart racing. He hesitated for a moment, debating with himself whether to investigate or simply ignore it. Perhaps it was just a guest who had dropped something, but curiosity and growing concern drove him out from behind the counter and down the corridor, which seemed to get longer as he approached the source of the noise. When he reached the top floor, the corridor was immersed in an eerie gloom, with only a few dim lights illuminating the way. Every step Johnny took seemed to echo off the walls, amplifying his nervousness. He walked slowly, his eyes fixed on the door to room 217. As he approached, he noticed that the door was ajar, which was strange, considering that all the rooms were supposed to be locked. Johnny's heart was pounding as he approached the door. As he carefully pushed it open, the sight he encountered made the blood run cold in his veins. On the floor, just outside the room, lay a white handkerchief, stained with something dark and indistinguishable in the dim light. He stood still, staring at the handkerchief, as if he were facing something much more threatening than a simple piece of cloth. Johnny knew he had to get out of there, but something kept him from moving. He felt that somehow the scarf was a sign, a message left for him. His mind raced with thoughts of the man who had insisted so much on getting that room. What did he really want? And why that room, specifically? Suddenly, a movement at the end of the corridor caught his eye. Raising his eyes slowly, Johnny saw a figure standing in the distance. It was the man from reception, the same one who had tried to bribe him earlier. He stood there, motionless, watching Johnny with a gaze that seemed to pierce the darkness. Dread gripped Johnny, freezing him in place. The shadowy figure didn't move. It just stood there, as if waiting for something. The receptionist knew he had to act, but fear kept him trapped. Finally, mustering all the courage he had left, he took a step backwards, away from the door and the terrifying sight. Without taking his eyes off the man at the end of the corridor, Johnny began to back away slowly, his breathing rapid and his body trembling. When he finally managed to get far enough away, he turned and ran back to reception as fast as his legs would allow. Behind him, the corridor remained silent, but Johnny knew he wasn't alone. He reached reception, his heart racing, and picked up the phone with trembling hands. He needed to call the police immediately. Something was very wrong in that hotel, and he no longer had any doubt that the man was involved in something sinister. As he dialed the number, Johnny felt that the night had become a nightmare from which he desperately wanted to wake up. Johnny could barely keep calm as he waited for the police to answer the call. The phone felt heavy in his sweaty hands, and the silence that enveloped the hotel was almost unbearable. When the call was finally answered, he stammered as he tried to explain the situation, his trembling voice reflecting the dread he felt. I need help. A man. He was here, trying to get into a room that's occupied. I heard a noise. I went to check, and now he's following me. I'm at the Hotel Bella Vista, on the main road, room 217. Johnny had barely finished speaking before he heard a noise coming from the corridor behind him. Johnny's heart stopped for an instant. He turned around slowly, with the phone still pressed to his ear, but no longer paying attention to the voice on the other end of the line. His eyes fixed on the entrance to the corridor leading to the rooms, and his blood ran cold when he saw the man from before standing there in the dim light. The man was motionless, just like upstairs. His eyes, fixed on Johnny, were cold and empty, as if there was no emotion behind them. It was as if he were a shadow, a presence that shouldn't be there, but that refused to go away. The penetrating gaze made Johnny feel that he was being watched, not by a mere human being, but by something much more sinister. Johnny instinctively took a step back, trying to increase the distance between them. However, the man advanced, slowly, with calculated steps. He was in no hurry, as if he was sure that Johnny had nowhere to run. The receptionist tried to say something, but his voice caught in his throat. The fear was paralyzing. As the man approached, Johnny felt a growing pressure in his chest, as if he was about to suffocate. He knew he had to act, but his body wouldn't respond. All he could do was watch helplessly as the stranger shortened the distance between them. Finally, when the man was only a few meters away, Johnny managed to muster the strength to take another step backwards until his back met the cold wall behind the reception desk. He was trapped. It was at that moment that the man stopped, his expression unchanged. The silence between the two was almost deafening, full of unspoken threats. Johnny opened his mouth to shout, to call for help, but before he could make a sound, the man spoke. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but each word seemed to cut through the air with deadly precision. "You shouldn't have refused. Now it's too late." Those words hit Johnny like a physical blow, making his body tremble with fear. He knew there was nothing more he could do. He felt like a puppet, controlled by invisible strings, and the man in front of him was the master. He was at the mercy of something he didn't understand. Suddenly, the distant sound of sirens began to echo along the road. The police were coming. The man heard it too, and for a brief moment, something changed in his expression. He cast one last glance at Johnny, filled with something that seemed a mixture of disdain and satisfaction. And then, without warning, he turned around and disappeared down the corridor. Johnny stood still, breathless, unable to move. The relief at seeing the man go was quickly replaced by terror that he was still around, waiting, watching. When the front doors of the hotel opened and the policeman entered, Johnny almost collapsed with relief. He pointed down the corridor, trying to explain what had happened, but when the officers ran to investigate, they found no one. The man had disappeared as mysteriously as he had appeared. Room 217 was empty, and the stained handkerchief on the floor had also disappeared. The police searched the hotel, but found no sign of the intruder. It was as if he had never been there. However, Johnny knew the truth. He had been there, and whatever it was, it had left an indelible mark on his mind. While the policeman asked questions and took notes, Johnny only wanted one thing: to get out of there and never come back. After the officers had finished inspecting the hotel and found no sign of the man, Johnny felt a mixture of relief and frustration. How could something so real, so terrifying, just disappear without a trace? The policeman tried to reassure him, saying that perhaps it was just a disturbed guest who ran away when he heard the sirens. But Johnny knew that there was something much more sinister behind that presence. The rest of the night was a blur for him. With his nerves on edge, Johnny could no longer concentrate on anything. Every noise, no matter how insignificant, set his heart racing. The hours dragged on, and he found himself looking at his watch over and over again, begging for his shift to end. When the sun finally began to appear on the horizon, casting a dim light over the hotel, Johnny felt a sense of relief bordering on despair. As soon as the morning shift receptionist arrived to replace him, Johnny wasted no time. He quickly passed on the instructions, barely managing to hide the tremor in his voice, and left the hotel without looking back. The drive home seemed longer than usual. Every corner he turned, every car he passed, seemed to be full of invisible threats. Even after entering his apartment and locking the door, Johnny couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, as if the man was still around, lurking in the shadows. Over the next few days, Johnny tried to get back into his routine, but it was no use. The image of the man standing in the corridor, his empty eyes fixed on him, was engraved in his mind. He began to have nightmares, waking up in the middle of the night with the feeling that someone was inside his room, watching him. Fear followed him like a shadow, no matter where he was or what he was doing. Finally, after a week of torment, Johnny made a decision. He could no longer go back to the hotel. The place, which had once been just a monotonous job, had turned into a nightmare from which he couldn't escape. Every time he thought about going back to reception, he felt a deep, almost visceral dread. He wrote a simple but sincere letter of resignation, explaining that he was no longer able to continue working there. He sent the letter by email and felt a wave of relief when he pressed the send button, as if he was finally freeing himself from an unbearable burden. Although he had quit his job, Johnny knew that the memories of that night would never leave him. There was something about the man, about that experience, that had marked him forever. The question he had never been able to answer, about what really happened and who that man was, continued to haunt him. Johnny's life moved on, but the shadow of that night in the hotel was always with him. Even in his quieter moments, there was a part of him that kept looking over his shoulder, hoping to see those cold, empty eyes once again. And although he did everything he could to forget, the fear that the man was still out there, waiting, never completely disappeared. Johnny never worked in another hotel again. The experience left a mark on him, and he knew that no matter how much time passed, that night would always be with him, like a dark secret buried in his memory, ready to emerge at the most unexpected moments.